From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Monday, August 21st. What happens on a visceral level if you defy Vladimir Putin? In the nearly 18 months since the Russian president invaded Ukraine, we've seen what happens on a broad scale when a nation defies Putin's wrath. Thousands of people have been massacred, entire cities have been turned to rubble, and millions of families have become refugees. But what happens to an individual who's been singled out by Putin as a direct threat to his power? In his first Australian media interview from prison since being jailed last year, one of Russia's most high-profile dissidents has been able to give us the answer. Ilya Yashin is a 2 decades-long veteran of Russia's anti-Putin opposition. A former leader of the People's Freedom Party, he rose to prominence during mass protests against fraudulent elections and Putin's return to presidency.
We would like to create the alternative source of information, to tell to people the truth.
More recently, he's spoken out against the Ukraine war.
Opposition politician Ilya Yashin believed that his criticism of the war would sound louder and be more convincing if he stayed in Russia. So he did. His criticism was heard, and the government scrambled to silence him.
Today, international and political editor Peter Hartcher on the man who could arguably become Russia's next prime minister, and what it's costing him to try and bring about a change in the Russian regime. So, Peter, you've introduced countless readers, including myself, to this powerful and charismatic member of Russia's democratic movement. And yet I imagine I'm not alone in having never heard of Ilya Yashin before. So what can you tell me about him?
Well, don't be hard on yourself there, Samantha. Ilya Yashin is not terribly well known in the outside world beyond Russia. Partly that's because he's been, well, all the democratic politicians of Russia have been overshadowed by Alexei Navalny. Alexei Navalny was the leader of the opposition in Russia, but of course it's difficult to do that now that he's been jailed for 19 years. Alexei Navalny is the most famous, and a lot of that's got to do with Vladimir Putin's attempts to kill him, including famously getting agents to put a nerve agent, Novichok, inside his underpants, which is cartoonishly villainesque. And yet it nearly succeeded. He was seriously ill and had to be rushed to a hospital in Germany to save his life. But then he got even more fame, with Putin notoriety, I'm sure, because he then chose to return to Russia when he could have simply taken off. He returned to Russia, extraordinary feat of bravery, knowing that he would be arrested and sentenced to jail. And just 2 weeks ago, I think, his 9-year jail sentence was extended to 19 years. And he said he's happy to wear that. So Navalny has absolutely overshadowed everybody else. But then there's also Vladimir Kara-Murza, is another prominent, famous and credentialed democratic politician. And then there's Ilya Yashin. And Ilya Yashin, apart from being overshadowed by Navalny, he's also very young. He's only 40. But he has co-founded a youth movement in Russia. He's member of democratic political parties. The only public office he's held is at a pretty local level, equivalent to a local council in Moscow. But he has emerged as a strong moral voice and an unafraid critic of Vladimir Putin.
Right, and I was really struck by an expert that you've got quoted who said that Yashin really matters, so much so that he could even be a prime minister should Putin fall.
Yes, Robert Horvath, who's an expert on Russian politics, has said he's one of the most principled and fearless people in Russia today. And yeah, indeed, he said he would, in a post-Putin Russia, likely feature as at least a senior government minister and possibly prime minister. And given how young he is, presumably he would have a long future ahead of him, but that's all presuming a post-Putin world.
Okay, and maybe you can take us through the scene of what actually happened, because we understand 13 months ago, Ilya Yashin was sentenced to prison and he'd actually been grabbed by some police in a Moscow park. So what's he been in prison for, and how did this go down?
Well, yes, he unfolds the story of how he was out for a pleasant evening stroll in a Moscow park when he was set upon by a group of police officers who nabbed him, of course, but then in court charged him with attacking a group of police officers. They reversed the story, which he thought was pretty funny. And that then led eventually to the charge that he had been, quote, discrediting, unquote, the Russian military for the invasion of Ukraine, for which he's been sentenced to 8.5 years jail. That law is a new law that Putin introduced only after the invasion started, and it's never really run terribly smoothly, so I'm sure he didn't enjoy criticism, and what dictator does. But he introduced a new law that critics of the war could go to jail for up to 15 years, and that's the law under which Ilya Yashin has been jailed.
Which is massive, because I think Ilya Yashin himself pointed out that people who are convicted of rape and murder sometimes get smaller sentences than that.
Well, I think it's correct that the maximum sentence for murder in Russia is 15 years. So to have the same sentence potentially for criticising the war is obviously drastic and draconian. And look, Ilya Yashin made the point to me, and through me to the readership, that this is just a symbol of Putin's sensitivity to criticism and how unpopular the war is, because, as Ilya Yashin says, if the war weren't unpopular, Putin would simply ignore us. But he knows that what I say when I say that Putin is a war criminal, and when I say that the war is a catastrophe, Putin knows that a lot of people agree with me, and that's why he's sensitive to it and has to lock me up to try and shut me down. But obviously, through speaking to journalists such as me, Samantha, and through me to you and to the readers, he's not been daunted and he's not been shut down.
Okay, and I really wanted to ask you about this because you've actually managed to conduct this interview with Ilya Yashin while he's in prison, and it's the first media outlet in Australia to do so. And we're all just wondering, how did you manage to do this? Because you're banned from entering Russia by decree from Moscow because of your own reporting on Vladimir Putin. So how did you pull this off?
Yeah, I'm banned from entering Russia and he's banned from leaving his jail cell. So it wasn't going to happen in person, Samantha.
Yes.
But he's also not allowed phone access. So what happened was one of his supporters contacted me and said, Ilya is able to get written materials out in and out of his jail cell. So if you would like, we can organise an interview where you send him written questions and we'll get them to him through his lawyer, which I did. And about a week later, his lawyer came back with handwritten answers, 10 pages of handwritten answers in blue ink in Russian, which we then had translated, and hence the interview.
I mean, just to set the scene here, it really is almost something like out of a film, because I'm picturing he's actually written this letter to you. You wrote in your article, in his prison cell, he recently celebrated his birthday there with cake with his cellmates who are a drug kingpin, an arms dealer, and a con man. So that's where this letter comes from, right?
That's right. I did ask him. I noticed that his birthday had been recent, and I asked him how he'd spent the day. And that's how he spent it. He said, my family managed to get me some cake in jail, so obviously his jailers have some humanity in them. And yes, he shared it with his drug lord and arms dealer and con man cellmates. He also made the point that he'd been arrested the day before his previous birthday, and that this is a common tactic, he said, with Russian security services, that to maximize the psychological impact of nabbing you, they do it when you're in expectation of, some great celebration. In this case, it was his birthday, and they nabbed him the night before.
Which brings me to my next question, which is that Ilya Yashin told you that he knew his arrest was inevitable from months before he was grabbed by Russian police in a Moscow park. So why didn't he flee, as so many of his fellow dissidents have?
Yeah, this is a key question that tells you so much about his character. Like Alexei Navalny and Vladimir Karamurza, he decided that although he knew he was going to be arrested, knew that he was going to have to suffer, and knew that Putin would show very little mercy, that he was going to stay in Russia. So almost all the democratic leaders in Russian politics left. When that 15-year jail term was introduced for any critics, it was pretty clear that the real intention was to force his critics to leave the country rather than subsist under that threat. So they left. But these leaders stayed. And as Ilya Yashin put it to me, he decided to stay because he said it's fundamentally important that there are anti-war voices being heard speaking inside Russia, not just from comfortable perches outside Russia, and that this would, he hoped, inspire others in Russia who are opposed to the war and help to rehabilitate the reputation of his country and his countrymen outside Russia.
One thing I was really intrigued by in your interview with him is his passion for defending the Russian people, the ordinary Russian people, and making it clear that so many of them are not complicit with Putin and this war that he has waged against Ukraine. And he seemed to make the connection between the view of ordinary Russian people as being complicit, as that somehow shifting the blame for war crimes from the Kremlin junta to ordinary citizens, and that it doing so eases the Putin regime's moral and political burden. Do you agree with him?
Yeah, I think that's a really fundamental point too, Samantha, because Putin claims to be waging this war on behalf of Mother Russia with a great historical mission and a great national purpose and with the public support. And the opinion polls conducted within Russia all suggest consistently, suspiciously consistently, if you ask me, that his public support is around the 80% mark. So all of this implies that this is a united or relatively united Russian war being waged against Ukraine. Ilya Yashin's point is, no, this is not the fault of the Russian people. This is a criminal regime, he says, that is burdening the country with this. The majority of Russian people don't want the war. They're not enjoying the suffering they're being put through. They don't support the war, and they don't support Putin. So it was striking to me. I gave Ilya the opportunity to make a request or a plea on his own behalf, but he didn't take it. He doesn't ask for anything for himself. He doesn't ask for any special, pity or conditions. His only plea is on behalf of the Russian people. He says, I want to say to Australians, this is not Russia, this is Putin, and one day our country will return to the civilized world. Don't give up on my country, he says. He's not giving up on it, and he doesn't want us to give up on Russia either.
I was really struck by his stoicism and something in particular that he said to you. How I conduct myself behind bars, he said, how I withstand the pressure will influence whether my supporters and like-minded people succumb to greater apathy or, on the contrary, are emboldened and acquire strength to fight for their future. I can't have been the only reader of your column to read that and feel, in comparison, to be like a broken-toothed hobbit of a person, just woeful in comparison. Where does this passion and commitment come from, do you think?
First of all, I'd like to assure listeners that Samantha is not actually a broken-toothed hobbit, but I do confess that reading these words from Ilya Yashin, sentenced to 8.5 years in a Moscow jail cell, did make me feel a little bit inadequate too. It's just such noble sentiments. He said he had to prepare himself morally, as he put it. That's a direct quote. Before being arrested, he was waiting months knowing that he would be arrested. He was making regular YouTube videos where he was critical of the war in Ukraine, critical of Putin's conduct, critical of a bunch of some of the most brutal of Russia's warlords. He knew that there was going to be some serious retribution, and he said he'd prepared himself. Where within his soul or his background he draws this strength, I don't know, but it's obvious from his words and the fact that he did stay when he could easily have left and had a comfortable life in the West somewhere, that he is a committed patriot.
And I'm just wondering, the fact that he has been jailed for this, is it a reflection of perhaps desperation on Putin's part and a waning of his power? Because we do know that many, many dissidents, thousands, I believe, have been arrested since Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
Well, it's been quite shocking under this don't criticize the war law, the number and nature of the arrests. And one guy that really startled a lot of people, there was one case where a father was sent to jail for 2 years because his little girl at school painted an anti-war painting. These are the extremes that you see in dictatorships, autocracies, where everybody's falling over themselves to prove that they're more loyal to the great leader than everybody else, and you end up with these absurdities.
Do you think that Yashin's prison sentence is a reflection of perhaps a desperation on Putin's part?
I think it does reflect desperation on Putin's part. And isn't it telling that these so-called self-styled strongman leader types like him, like China's Xi Jinping and others, it doesn't matter how many nuclear bombs they've got, how many soldiers they've got, how much economic power they've got. They are so sensitive to criticism. They cannot breathe a word of criticism. They are not strong men. They are pathetically weak. And this is a classic example of that.
That is such a fascinating point you make there. And so what was Yashin's forecast for how the war in Ukraine might unfold?
Well, he made the point that it's all in the hands of the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian people, that Putin is now in a weak position and is for months now been signaling very clearly that he wants to negotiate. Zelensky in Ukraine is not interested in negotiating because the war momentum is on his side. Yashin says if the Ukrainians decide that they want to fight to the end, then it's going to be a very long and very hard war. But if the Ukrainians decide that they want a settlement, then it could potentially be achieved quite quickly. But at the price that the Ukrainians would have to pay, of course, is that Russia would still be on some of their territory, and Russia presumably would still be waging some level of covert war, because at no point has Putin ceased his warfare against the Ukrainians since the original incursions in 2014. And at no point has he kept to any of his undertakings about humanitarian corridors or other cessations of violence. So it would be a very ugly peace or a long and extended war in Ilya Yashin's view.
Thank you, Peter, as always, for joining us.
Pleasure, Samantha.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Margaret Gordon. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.